Hello, everyone. Good morning to those who are tuning in the United States, and good evening to those who are joining us from Moscow. My name is Matt Rojansky. I'm director of the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute, and am very pleased, just as Sarah and Phil are, to be able to be moving forward with the Fort Ross Dialogue this year with an incredible group of speakers, despite the challenging circumstances. And I'm very grateful to the Fort Ross Conservancy, to our sponsor, Chevron, Transneft, and SOCOM Float, to Philip and the World Affairs Council, and of course to Governor Brown, Ambassador Antonov, who have been driving forces of this meeting. I'd like to say keeping my home state, because I am a Northern California native, on the map of global security and diplomacy in the field and in this relationship, the U.S.-Russia relationship that I care so much about. It's really unique and special that the state of California and the history of our state can play such an important role in the contemporary relationship. We've been doing this for nearly a decade. As was mentioned, 1812 was the official beginning of the fort, and so 2012 was its 200th anniversary. Will be my first year, and I think all of ours, without getting to see our friends and colleagues, and in my case, even family in person out in California. But we can at least enjoy a glass of California wine. You can pretty much get it anywhere, including, and I can prove this, in Russia. So I recommend that when appropriate, you pour yourself a glass and raise a toast to this ongoing and very necessary enterprise. Speaking of anniversaries, this year also marks, as Ambassador Antonov correctly said, 75 years since the victory in World War II, which is a very positive memory. But of course, it's mixed with the very painful memory of the first and, thank God, thus far only use of nuclear weapons in war in that same year, 75 years ago. And as has been mentioned as well, it's 50 years since the entry into force of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty in 1970. Soon, it will be 10 years since the New START Treaty's entry into force, and we're going to talk a lot more about that. What I wonder is whether the arc of civilization that we see over that nearly a century span of time is one that goes in a positive direction, or one that has bent in a more negative and dangerous direction. And I think this is a time of uncertainty about those questions, and so I'm greatly reassured to have our two very distinguished guests to focus on those challenges today in this conversation. Throughout the panel, we welcome questions. Please submit them via the chat function in the Whova app. And what I'll do is I'll first introduce Rose Gottemuller to give her remarks, and then I will introduce, as possible afterwards, open the floor to questions from all of you so that we can end on time and move on to our next panel. These two speakers, I can simply say, their bios are everywhere on the internet, and they're on the portal as well. There's no chance I can do justice to their tremendous achievements, but I will simply try by hitting the highlights. Rose Gottemuller currently serves as the Frank E. and Arthur W. Payne Distinguished Lecturer at Stanford's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and its Center for International Security and Cooperation. She's also a research fellow at the Hoover Institution. Before coming to Stanford, many of you will know she was Deputy Secretary General of NATO from 2016 to 2019, where she helped drive forward NATO's adaptation to new security challenges in Europe and the fight against terrorism. Prior to that, she served nearly 5 years as Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security at the U.S. Department of State, advising the Secretary of State on arms control, nonproliferation, and political military affairs. While Assistant Secretary of State for Arms Control, Verification, and Compliance in 2009 and 2010, she was the chief U.S. negotiator for the aforementioned New START Treaty with the Russian Federation. Prior to her government service, she was a senior associate with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, with joint appointments to the Nonproliferation and Russia programs, and served as director of the Carnegie Moscow Center from 2006 to 2008, and remains a non-resident fellow in Carnegie's nuclear program. I will simply add, as a personal note, including going back to my own time at Carnegie, she's a role model for all of us in the United States who work on U.S.-Russia relations, on nuclear security, and pursue the cause of peace. She really showcases the value of diplomacy with her unique ability to earn trust and to work towards mutually beneficial goals, even in the most difficult of contexts. And I suspect I'm not exceeding my mandate by saying we're going to hear a little bit today about how we can do that from you, Rose. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Matt, and it's truly a pleasure to be with you today. It's a great honor to appear at this Fort Ross dialogue with my longtime Russian colleagues, Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Rybkov and Ambassador Anatoly Antonov. It's truly a pleasure to see you gentlemen this morning, if only in virtual space. I'm also very much enjoying being with you, Matt, and thank you for your comments about California wine. As it's only 8 a.m. here, I'll wait a few hours before I crack mine open, but it is definitely easy to get here in the Bay Area. And thank you, Governor Brown, for inviting me to participate. I would like to stress as I begin that I'm speaking for myself only, not representing anyone else. Some of you will have seen my September article in the Washington Quarterly, where I lay out 3 phases for nuclear arms control in future. The first phase, I think we need a few quick wins right now, of which a 5-year New START extension is most important for both the United States and Russia. However, I also think we should consider an additional nuclear reduction on the model of the 2002 Moscow Treaty. If New START stays in force until 2026, a new reduction could be implemented riding on the back of it, so to say. We could use the verification regime, the data exchange, the notification procedures, and other procedures. They could all work to implement a new reduction. This is akin to what happened with the Moscow Treaty, when an additional reduction in operationally deployed warheads took place and START remained in force to provide the implementation mechanism. The second phase is what I call the middle distance, treaties or agreements that will take longer to negotiate because they are complicated or involve new players. Here is where we should consider direct limitations on nuclear warheads, not simply limiting them through their association with their delivery vehicles, as we do in New START and previously did in START and in the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty. This direct limitation of warheads will take longer to negotiate because we have never tried it before, and the monitoring and verification regime will be complex and difficult. I would argue, however, that we should discuss together how we would do it on a bilateral basis. We should also, in this medium term, consider how to engage new players, such as China, which has never agreed to limit its nuclear forces through negotiation, although it has joined in other treaties, such as the NPT, indeed this year celebrating its 50th anniversary, and the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the CTBT. To engage China, I think that we need to look for areas where the Chinese have some equality and capability with the other players. Their strategic nuclear arsenal is so small that it does not make sense to try to pull them into New START or into a New START follow-on treaty. The United States and Russia far outnumber them in deployed nuclear warhead numbers and delivery vehicles. However, engaging them on an issue where they have equality is another matter. I argue that they could have an interest in negotiations to constrain intermediate range ground-launched missiles in Asia because they are concerned about US deployments of such missiles in their region, and they may be concerned about Russian modern intermediate range missiles appearing in their region also. Here is an area where there is some equality in missile numbers. So in thinking about engaging the Chinese, we have to consider this equality of capability matter. Otherwise, why would they see it in their interest to negotiate? The third phase is the long term, where I think that we need to consider the future of how we structure our arms control interactions. In particular, I think that we must consider the future of monitoring and verification. Soon, the ability of mankind to fully image the face of the Earth on a daily basis may make it possible to conduct a lot of effective arms control measures without the volume of on-site presence we've had over the past 35 years, since the INF Treaty ushered in on-site inspection and perimeter portal continuous monitoring. If continuous monitoring becomes reliable using national technical means, then boots on the ground, that is inspectors, will be needed only for monitoring particularly high-risk small objects such as warheads. We need to study this phenomenon together. What will be the future of national technical means, the future of monitoring and verification? In closing, I would like to pay my compliments Some of you may be surprised at this, but but I'd like to say I would like to pay my compliments to the Russian and US negotiators who have been working to advance this agenda over the past 4 years. Although there have been many negative developments, such as the demise of the INF Treaty and most recently the Open Skies Treaty, the US has withdrawn from it. Of course, other signatories remain, but it has been a negative series of developments. Nevertheless, important principles have been broached for the first time at the negotiating table, and they will shape our discussions going forward. I stress three of them. The first is the notion that warheads should be limited directly, which took its initial shape in the total freeze on all warheads that President Trump proposed and President Putin agreed just over a month ago. A freeze is an important step, but only a first step toward limiting warheads. Second principle is the notion that others should join us at the table, China most importantly. These talks might begin bilaterally between Beijing and Washington or trilaterally among the three of us, US, Russia, and China. I would argue, however, that the P5 process has matured considerably in the past 10 years and could also serve as a discussion venue, the P5 process involving also the UK and France. I want to stress that discussion will be important to begin with. We cannot rush into negotiation with new players. Finally, the evolution of the Russian moratorium proposal so that it has become less directed at constraining only US intermediate range ground launch systems in Europe. This is an important development. The 9M729 missile is now on the table with the monitoring proposal, and I welcome this Russian approach to permit the 9M729 can be limited without acceding to the US position, shared with its allies, both in NATO and in Asia, that the missile violates the INF Treaty. Much additional work will have to be done, but this evolved moratorium proposal is a start. With that, I will give the floor back to you, Matt. I thank you very much again for this opportunity, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Rose. You lived precisely up to the billing, and I think even exceeded it by offering some very important and very timely proposals about how we might be able to move forward. And although the advice for living at peace with the world as it is often to think of yourself as not being unique, as simply a passenger on the course of life, I think we have found uniquely the right partner for this conversation in Deputy Minister Ryabkov. He is a truly unique and important voice on these topics. So let me introduce him now. He is the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, of course, with responsibility for bilateral relations with North and South America, non-proliferation and arms control, Iran's nuclear program, and Russia's participation in the BRICS. He holds the diplomatic rank of Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary, has been awarded the Order of Service to the Fatherland, 4th class, and the Order of Honor and the Order of Friendship. From 2005 to 2008, he served as Director of the Department of European Cooperation, and from 2002 to 2005, he was at the Russian Embassy in the United States as Envoy Extraordinary and Minister Plenipotentiary. Before that, he was Senior Counselor at the Embassy and was the head of the OSCE desk in the Department of European Cooperation. Let me add that I have been a regular visitor to the Executive Conference Room in Mead, often to meet with Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov, and I am always, as I wait for the meeting, in awe of the beautiful historical art and artifacts, and of course of this historic building itself. But as soon as he enters the room, I am in awe of this diligent, dedicated, and formidable representative of his country. It's true we don't always agree, and we are very often conveying and receiving messages that the other side may not be thrilled to hear, but we always find a productive partner who is ready to listen, to engage thoughtfully, and to seek and propose a productive path forward. And I have no doubt that today will be an example of the very same. Minister Ryabkov, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Matt, for this extremely generous introduction. I look very much forward to welcoming you once again to the Stalin skyscraper or building aside of it, so that you continuously enjoy some artifacts here and then we engage in some exchanges. Let me start by recognizing the Fort Ross Conservancy and I'm so glad to participate in this year 2020 Fort Ross Dialogue. I used to participate offline earlier on many occasions. This year, circumstances preclude from doing this in person, but I particularly welcome Governor Brown. I appreciate efforts of Ms. Sarah Swidler and everyone at Fort Ross Conservancy for making it possible. I likewise appreciate and recognize participation of both Ambassador Antonov and Ambassador Gottmüller. I wish we would have more chances in the time to come to exchange on issues before us, spanning from legacy of early Russian entry into North America over to current cooperation on issues like COVID-19 and economic interaction, including between regions of US and Russia, and also definitely all the issues in relation to strategic stability. Let me say a few words broader than the immediate set of topics before us right at this particular moment, which I believe still would be of some use for all of you. We believe that international relations are characterized today by the growth of political turbulence, tensions, and unpredictability. We are witnessing the exacerbation of old and the emergence of new threats to international and regional security, as well as multiplication of military and political factors undermining international peace. At the same time, the arms control system that has traditionally served us as a kind of a safety net for global strategic stability is now, as all present here understand, experiencing an unprecedented crisis. The world is also facing sharp deterioration in relations among nuclear powers. Our assessment is that current deplorable situation in the field of international security is largely the result of aspirations to military domination and search for tools that would allow stronger pressures on political opponents. Actually, concepts of peace through strength and great power competition do not really go well with maintaining strategic stability and promoting arms control, for they are based on the idea of racing for superiority. I have to note that all previous attempts to achieve peace through strength have notoriously failed, and competition is hardly an appropriate basis for building stable and cooperative relationships. Russia consistently opposes attempts to weaken the established architecture of treaties and agreements in the area of security, stability, non-proliferation, and arms control. We also support the development of new arrangements where appropriate. Russia stands for a substantial, constructive, and result-oriented dialogue on such matters which would enable us to reduce problems and tensions in the area of strategic stability, providing predictability and restraint based on the principle of equal and indivisible security for all, as was mentioned by distinguished Ambassador Antonov. This concept is reflected in the NPT review process, disarmament-related language, for several years, decades now, and I quote, in a way that promotes international stability, peace, and undiminished and increased security, end quote, and also based on the principle of increased and undiminished security for all. One important thing to note here, we do not see advancing arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation as a self-sufficient goal. For us, this is one of the means to ensure Russia's national security, in this case by using political and diplomatic tools. One should also remember that arms control is always a deal, so it would be totally unrealistic to expect one side to give away its interests for nothing. It's always a two-way street. We are ready to proceed on such basis with all interested states in the spirit of consensus, equality, and balanced consideration of legitimate security concerns of parties. The ultimate goal here should be to launch discussions involving all nuclear-armed states. I tend to agree with what was said by Rose a few moments ago, that P5 moves into a degree of considerable maturity for this type of engagement. But we also consider it to be counterproductive to try to press someone or bully someone to participate in such discussions, and even worse, to use the so-called third country excuse to create artificial obstacles for the development of dialogue and interaction on the most pressing issues of today. We in Russia are strongly convinced that our bilateral arms control agenda with the US is far from being exhausted. Under current circumstances, it is very important to keep the communication lines open. We are glad that after a long, maybe way too long break this year, we had a very intensive dialogue with the US. Russia has been calling for reopening this axis of communication for quite a period of time. It is a venue that allows us to address our respective security concerns and ways to promote them. Meetings that we had with the US have shown that we have different and somewhat conflicting approaches to the very subject of the dialogue. The prospects of the New START treaty was naturally a focal point of the strategic dialogue. Russia consistently advocated its extension without any preconditions for 5 years. Our main concern was to preserve the due level of openness and predictability between Russia and the US. Extension naturally would also buy time for comprehensive bilateral discussions on the future nuclear and missile weapons control, taking into account all factors affecting strategic stability. In general terms, extending the treaty would be a reasonable step to prevent further deterioration of strategic environment and to avoid a complete collapse of nuclear arms control. Unfortunately, no agreement on the extension of the treaty was reached so far. At the strategic dialogue meetings with the US, Russia has presented numerous proposals on the draft framework for eventual future arms control arrangements. It is broad and ambitious, but still realistic and balanced. The underlying idea is to jointly develop a new, what I would call strategic equation, taking into account all factors affecting strategic stability, including emerging kinds of weapons, prospective technologies, as well as new political realities. We want this equation to cover not only traditional strategic arms such as ICBMs, SLBMs, and heavy bombers with their respective ordnance, but also all nuclear and non-nuclear weapons that are capable of accomplishing strategic tasks, with particular attention to means usable for launching a first strike to neutralize or weaken the deterrent potential of the other side. If adopted, this concept will really make the world a much safer place. Thus, we have proposed to identify weapons that pose threat to the national territory of each side, taking into consideration quantitative and qualitative aspects of balance of forces, between Russia and its allies on one hand, and the United States and its allies on the other hand, regarding both nuclear and conventional weapons, as well as the specifics of their deployment. We are equally ready to define the structure and quantitative limitations for deployed nuclear warheads that are capable to strike the national territory of the other side, and to discuss quantitative and geographic limitations for deployment of missile defense systems. Let me elaborate a bit more on missile defense issue. We cannot just walk away from this topic. It requires a serious discussion, for there is a direct and undeniable interlink between strategic offensive arms and strategic defensive ones. This interrelationship becomes even more important as missile defense assets reveal their capacity to intercept strategic missiles that represent the backbone of nuclear deterrence. Since Washington pulled out of the ABM Treaties some 20 years ago, there are no political nor legal constraints on missile defense assets and technologies which have been developed and continue to be developed in the most destabilizing way, undermining international security. This, in turn, practically entails the emergence of new generation of weapons specially intended to maintain the efficiency of the deterrence. Plans were already announced to deploy missile defense assets in space and to carry out missile defense by preemptively hitting adversary missiles on the ground left to launch. People who promote such ideas should remember that the particular logic of preemptive disarming first strike has generated the multiplication of counterforce nuclear scenarios that were fueling an arms race for decades and that have repeatedly brought the world to the brink of a nuclear war. For 15 years, we have tried to bring Washington to discuss missile defense, but the US has simply waved our concerns aside. There is a clear need for an honest, professional, and comprehensive discussion on this topic. Coming back to our strategic dialogue, Russian proposals to the US on the draft framework for future arms control imply development of common approaches to ensuring security of space activities, preventing an arms race in outer space, and excluding the possibility of placement of weapons in outer space. Naturally, appropriate verification measures to control the implementation of commitments and obligations corresponding to their subject and the scope should be agreed as well. Verification is really one of the strongest points of legally binding agreements that no external oversight may or should substitute. Those familiar with Russia-US nuclear arms reduction and limitation treaties know that they always include verification mechanisms intended to control and monitor their implementation. Russian approaches to strategic stability also envisage de-escalation measures, including creation of mechanisms to respond to crisis situations that may generate threat of a nuclear weapons use. Our principal conviction is that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. Such a credo stimulates us to consistently advocate for reaffirming, both on bilateral Russia-US track and also within the P5 format, this well-known Gorbachev-Reagan formula, thus stressing the inadmissibility of a nuclear war and ideally any war between nuclear states. We believe that at these turbulent times, international community is really looking for such a political message. Russia takes the issue of reducing nuclear risks most seriously. Russian nuclear doctrine stipulates that our country takes all necessary efforts to reduce nuclear threat and prevent aggravation of interstate relations that could trigger military conflicts, including nuclear ones. The doctrinal documents clearly say that Russia's policy in this area considers nuclear weapons exclusively as a means of deterrence, the only purpose being protecting the national sovereignty and territorial integrity of the state. Historically, Russia has accumulated considerable experience in the field of risk reduction through mutually beneficial interaction with other states. In terms of preventing conventional conflicts, including those fraught with nuclear risks, there has been developed a wide safety net of numerous arrangements, agreements, and measures to increase predictability and restraint, prevent and manage dangerous military activities or incidents, to ensure communication lines and their proper employment in crisis, and also to provide for de-escalation through means of diplomacy. Russia is open to engage where needed in a review process of such arrangements. We earlier proposed to update some of those. In particular, we presented concrete ideas to adapt the 1972 bilateral agreement with the US on the prevention of incidents on and over the high seas. Much could be gained in terms of lowering nuclear risks if NATO stops its practice of the so-called nuclear sharing that provides for involving non-nuclear states of the alliance in planning of nuclear weapons employment and specific training for such missions that non-nuclear weapon states are supposed to accomplish. Apart from the fact that this is an evident destabilization associated with this, it is also a direct violation of the NPT Article 1 and 2. We are equally concerned by the content of the US nuclear posture review. This document actually provides for increased role of nuclear weapons in military planning by envisaging, for instance, the development of low-yield nuclear weapons. Their started deployment inevitably lowers the nuclear threshold. In terms of operational planning, the NPR envisages a return to the concept of a limited nuclear war. It looks like the US nuclear thinking has moved back to half-a-century-old patterns when nuclear weapons use was a practical and acceptable political option. The NPR eliminated prospects for the CTBT entering into force. All of this is a matter of serious concern. Last but not least, one of the immediate concerns relates to the situation where there is no INF treaty anymore. Russia believes that it is high time to step away from the counterproductive and fruitless blame game around the demise of the treaty and proceed with creative diplomatic efforts to avoid another round of dangerous missile arms race in the post-INF world. Our country committed itself unilaterally not to deploy ground-based intermediate and shorter-range missiles in the regions where similar US systems will not appear. We called for the US and its allies to announce an equal moratorium. We proposed to agree on a possible verification and confidence-building regime for such a mutual moratorium. Our hope is that the US and its allies will choose wisely and act in the responsible manner. To sum up, Russia stands ready to continue discussions on all these matters with the US. We really have miles to go and plenty of time to catch. I thank everyone for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Deputy Minister Ryabkov. We have just about 20 minutes left in our session, and we have some questions coming in from the audience. I want to remind you You can post your question in the chat area of Huva. Go ahead and do that as soon as you can to make sure that I see it. But I'd like to direct a question first to Rose, and then a question to the Deputy Minister, if I can. Rose, um, I certainly would invite you to comment on anything that has been said. Some of the reiterated Russian ideas and proposals and comments would be interesting to get your perspective. But let me ask one pointed question as we sort of sit on the threshold of a new U.S. administration that will likely review a large number of current U.S. Strategies and policies and programs, including on nuclear weapons and other issues. It seems to me the U.S.-Russia relationship probably has to be on that list, and it has historically been true that arms control is sort of a gateway issue to restoring working trust in U.S.-Russia relations. I think you observed that firsthand negotiating the New START treaty amid the then reset sort of architecture of U.S.-Russia relations. I'm very curious how you would assess the prospects for following that same kind of traditional path of engaging productively on arms control, but looking for maybe a broader agenda of accomplishments that, as Deputy Minister Revkov said, they're not just about a good relationship, they are about the national security of both sides and the interests of both sides. I'd love to hear your comments on that, Rose.
Okay, thank you very, very much, Matt, and thank you to Sergei Rybkov for a really comprehensive presentation this morning. I apologize in advance to listeners. The team that does our lawn is outside, so you may hear the sound of lawnmowers and leaf blowers, but I apologize for any extra noise. In any event, again, I want to stress I'm only speaking for myself, but I do think that I've heard several very positive messages this morning. For me, as a person very interested in arms control and nuclear stability, non-proliferation, the future of the non-proliferation treaty, etc., I've been very pleased to hear Sergei Rybkov underscore, as he ended his remarks, that the Russian Federation stands ready to discuss all of these matters going forward, and he's really laid out a comprehensive list of all the areas that we need to discuss, and I certainly do agree with him on the agenda he put forth. The second point I would make, I found it very interesting that both Ambassador Antonov and Deputy Foreign Minister Rybkov stressed the need for people-to-people interactions. They talked about relationships between the individual states, such as California with the different regions of Russia, and cultural exchange such as that embodied by the Fort Ross Dialogue. I think these are also fruitful areas. We should look at the most terrible threats to our existence, the existential threats posed by nuclear weapons, and that goes not only for the United States, but for the Russian Federation as well. By the way, Sergei, I very much agree with your comments that we should not engage in arms control negotiations for their own sake, but because they serve our national security interests. That is true of the United States as well as the Russian Federation. It's the only reason to engage if they are another means to advance our national security. But I think then going to the other end of the spectrum and talking about people-to-people ties, talking about trade and economic interactions, but never forgetting that the United States, and I don't think there will be any change in this going forward, the United States and its allies are very concerned with some of the behavior we've seen from the Russian Federation in the past 10 years, including the seizure of Crimea at the top of the list, but many areas where the Russian Federation has been meddling, for example, in US elections, and there have been issues of concern that have resulted in sanctions being placed on the Russian Federation. So I think that we need to consider how to address some of these issues, how to solve some of these very difficult problems between our two countries and with the world community in general, and see how we can move forward, perhaps. But I do think that we need to bear in mind that there have been some very difficult moments in the bilateral relationship and in multilateral relations with Russia, with many concerns out there that are still on the table. So in sum, I don't expect any kind of a grand reset of the relationship. There's going to be some hard work ahead, some hard work, I think, for all of us.
Well, thank you again, Rose. And let me be the first to propose nominating you to negotiate a treaty banning two-cycle leaf blowers from the United States and maybe globally, because I would certainly support it. Deputy Minister Ryabkov, I would certainly invite you to comment on anything that Rose has said, but let me add specifically a question that's come up about multilateralizing arms control. That, of course, has been a practical question in the last several years as the topic has been raised by official negotiators on the US side, at least. But it is also contemplated in the vision, the spirit of the Non-Proliferation Treaty's basic bargain, if you will, that all nuclear weapon states, and there are, of course, more than two of them, will move towards eventual nuclear disarmament. So I'd like to get your sense. What does that future look like in terms of relatively nearer term steps over the next several years? For example, if New START is extended for 5 years, what would the multilateralization of arms control or a movement towards disarmament look like, let's say, between now and the next Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference? If you have any thoughts on that, I'd really welcome it. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Rose. On this very specific question, let me remind you that Russia officially pronounced its position in favor of going multilateral well before President Trump was elected to his position. No one at that moment even could consider the prospects of President Trump being elected. And Russia, by the time when we have reached central limitations, according to the New START, it will never be called Old START, though. At that moment, we said that we have practically reached the level after which or beyond which any further effort in the area of nuclear arms control and missile arms control should be done on a multilateral basis. In parallel, we said that all factors affecting strategic stability should also be taken into consideration, and in its entirety, it constituted a concept for a future of arms control that is still relevant and valid as of today. So, having said that, I will immediately need to stress that easier said than done. And we, of course, recognize and respect positions of others to whom it may concern, so to say. And in absence of a very clear and voluntary consent of those countries who may participate in this effort, there is no other choice than to continue our exchanges with the US on a bilateral basis. This is a matter of simple logic. This is not a case that relates one way or another to whatever, geopolitics or some grandeur schemes how to develop a new situation in the area of global security. This is just a practical consequence of what we are seeing around. We would definitely welcome participation of others, China included. But for the specific purpose of strengthening our own security, we will definitely put the need to bring UK and France to the table as a matter of priority, because those are the US closest allies, and we cannot, move further forward in kind of ignoring what kind of capabilities they possess. So we should have them at the table, and we said so very openly and straightforwardly to counterparts in Washington when we had these discussions with them. A couple of words on what was earlier said by Rose. I do think that we should, invest more into possible improvement of our bilateral relations. But particularly on the issue of Crimea, There is nothing to debate. It's actually a non-issue. It doesn't exist. It's over. We are not ready to exchange with the US on US sanctions. If the US wants to continue sanctioning Russia, be it. The moment will come that will show that this policy is completely failed, and it will nullify itself. There is no purpose of even looking into things like this, and we will never intend to exchange with any administration in future. This issue is resolved once and forever, and it doesn't exist. So some other aspects of what was mentioned by the Rose is debatable, equally debatable. I am a strong proponent of small steps approach, small steps tactics to our relations. There is no possibility, no room for anything else but to start a gradual improvement, beginning from a relative stabilization of where we are, starting from normalization of the function of diplomatic missions in both countries, respective missions in both countries, resolving some of the humanitarian issues, not just those who are, well known and which make headlines, but many others. So through this small steps approach, we hope we would be able to gradually begin to build up confidence. Otherwise, I don't believe any improvement from this very meager state of relations between our countries would be possible. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Foreign Minister, and I think you did a great job of illustrating exactly the situation that we're in, where we have very real disagreements. Progress does not seem like it's low-hanging fruit on those, and yet some bilateral negotiations and perhaps multilateral ones are essential for the future of the human species, as Governor Brown's global realism would have it, and others I think are necessary to make any progress at all in this relationship. The small steps I think is a wise approach. Let me direct a couple of questions to the audience. First to Rose. Deputy Minister Ryabkov talked quite a bit about the U.S. withdrawal from the ABM Treaty and ballistic missile defense, Rose. And one of the audience questions, therefore, I think can go to you, which is, how will the recent successful ICBM intercept test by the United States affect arms control and strategic stability talks? And I think a general sense of kind of how the U.S. looks at the practicalities of ballistic missile defense as it relates to that interrelationship between offense and defense that was mentioned, that in fact is enshrined in New START, if I recall correctly. And if I can tack on one more for you, Rose, I think it's another good one. Would resuming, among these sort of small steps, would resuming the work of the NATO-Russia Council be viewed as kind of low-hanging fruit for restoring confidence in the relationship?
Thank you, Matt, for those questions. Thank you to the audience for excellent questions. First of all, I will open up answering the first question by taking a little bit of exception with Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov saying that there had been no attempts to work the missile defense issue over the past 15 years. I remember very well my dear colleague who has now left us, Undersecretary at that time for International Security and Arms Control, Ellen Tauscher, was working very hard to try to develop missile defense cooperation with the Russian Federation, working with you, Sergei, and also working with many colleagues in Russia, in the Russian Ministry of Defense, and across the Russian interagency. So I do think that the United States has worked hard in the past 15 years to try to develop cooperation and mutual understanding on missile defense issues. I think we must continue that going forward. We need to re-energize our efforts in this regard. And I do think that having a wide-ranging consultation and looking at ways to develop more mutual confidence, because I will stress that, yes, the United States has been developing new capabilities. The interceptor test was part of the question. But I would say also the Russian Federation has been doing a lot to develop ever more effective missile defenses, some of which have implications at the strategic level. So I think there's good reason for us to be discussing these issues together. I will underscore again that the United States remains committed to a limited missile defense and one that will not undermine the effectiveness of the Russian strategic offensive deterrent. This remains U.S. policy. And so I don't see a major impact in technical terms for the interceptor test because it will be in the context of this limited capability. But again, these issues should be discussed, and there should be an effort, a real effort made to develop more mutual predictability in this area. On the NATO-Russia Council, I'm a great fan of the NATO-Russia Council. We worked hard in the 3 years when I was Deputy Secretary General of NATO to make it into a good forum for discussion of issues of mutual concern and also some very practical issues like responding to accidents and incidents. And I saw some of the developments in that venue as being important, particularly the development of our mutual exchange of briefings about our military exercises. I thought that was a good direction, and I would have liked to have seen more of the NATO-Russia Council. But unfortunately, as I understand, I left NATO a year ago, but as I understand, the Russian Federation has not been agreeing to hold a meeting of the NATO-Russia Council, despite the fact that the Secretary General Stoltenberg's put an offer on the table to do so. So I hope it can be resumed. I think it's a good venue and is a good place to discuss mutual concerns. Thank you, Matt. Back over to you.
Thanks very much, Rose. Well, we're running into the last couple of minutes here. So, Deputy Minister, I want to give you a chance to comment on anything else that Rose has said or any final remarks. But let me add one more question, if I can, very pointedly on two topics that you mentioned among the long list of issues to be discussed. When we talk about weapons in outer space and about cyberspace, these are inherently non-territorial domains. They're not carved up into borders that. Again, to come back to the sort of multilateralization topic, how do you view managing these challenges through a bilateral dialogue, a strategic stability dialogue with the United States, or a formal arms control dialogue, when it seems clear that a lot more countries and even perhaps non-state actors are going to have capabilities in these inherently non-territorial or non-terrestrial domains? So any thoughts on any of that would be very welcome, Mr. Deputy Minister.
Thank you. I don't think one excludes another. We can go multilateral where situation avails itself, and this is happening at appropriate platforms, be it UN, be it situations that are being discussed in terms of sustainability of space exploration at UN Space Committee in Vienna. All things are associated and interlinked with one another. And I would say that this is rather a mutually reinforcing effort. On bilateral basis with the US, though, I believe there are ample issues to be dealt with and discussed on these and other transborder kind of cross-dimensional, if you wish, issues that directly or indirectly affect our respective security and strategic stability as such. And in recent months, Russia and President Putin personally presented series of specific proposals how to deal with this, including in the area of IT security, or what is being called cybersecurity by our Western colleagues. So I wish the next administration of the United States will take time to consider this and come back to us with a meaningful response. We are very open to whoever may sit in this next US administration to continue these discussions from where we stopped. On what Rose has just said, I would urge everyone not to underestimate political and military technical impact of the most recent testing of the US missile defense capabilities on a target imitating ICBM. And this is exactly how we believe things are being gradually developed from something what was declared to be a very limited effort in order to address limited threats to a more multi-layered kind of a global system that begins to negatively affect the strategic deterrence of Russia. It's clearly something that will be with us more and more as a problem, as a concern. I do take note of what Rose said in terms of Russia moving forward in terms of developing its own capabilities in this area. Okay, that's fine, but we haven't heard insofar any of the concerns on the part of the US. If this starts to change, then we will need to address this as well. But it only reaffirms once again my earlier point that we do believe that there is an inseparable link between offensive strategic arms and defensive strategic arms. I think I stop here. Thank you.
Well, thank you both so much. I'm under strict instructions to make sure we end on time so we can have a short break and move on to the final session. So I just want to underscore how I think rich and productive a conversation this was. Very, very fitting to compensate for not being able to be with one another in person. I hope that you'll both be able to take part in a future in-person version of the Fort Ross Dialogue, and also that the negotiators who may well include yourselves in the future will learn from this example, which I think also illustrates why so much was achieved when the two of you were sitting in the seats behind the flags of your respective countries. So I'm very grateful to both of you and to the organizers for this opportunity. Thanks so much.